If you ever send me a document labeled strategy final, I don't even open it. I just reply back to the email and I say, no, it's not. Strategy is never final. You've got to kind of, again, break the notion that once something is in a plan, the plan must be executed. There's something about the word plan, right? It just frames our brain. Everything in this must get done. And I want it framed as I'm going to keep learning as I'm going.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by the Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Are you interested in advertising with the Action Catalyst? Our listeners could be hearing about your brand right here, right now. For details, shoot us an email at info@theactioncatalyst.com.
Today's guest is Dr. Rebecca Homkes, a high-growth strategy specialist, CEO, and executive advisor. She's a lecturer at the London Business School, faculty at Duke Corporate Executive Education, advisor and faculty at the Boston Consulting Group, and a former fellow at the London School of Economics Center for Economic Performance, as well as a former fellow at the White House's President's Council of Economic Advisors. Her book, Survive, Reset, Thrive, is out now.
How are you?
Excellent.
Let's start with your book, Survive, Reset, and Thrive.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much for asking. So Survive, Reset, Thrive was written starting in the spring of 2020, but it was based on frameworks and guidance that I've been using for a decade before that. Most of the book is things that I've been doing with companies who are looking to go on a growth journey. And what happened in that period of time, which was not dissimilar to happened in Brexit in 2016 here in the UK or in 2022, is that entrepreneurial leaders were calling me and saying the same thing. They were saying, why me? Why now? We had this growth pathway, things were working, and now we've got this crisis, right? And I found myself saying the same things over and over again. Like, yes, we're facing kind of a change situation, so we have to survive and stabilize. Then we need to reset because the strategy we had before needs to update for the changing time. And then you can go back to being a Thrive company. But we've got to go through this loop. And after repeating the same guidance for weeks at a time, I just finally wrote it down in an email. It was sent out on a Saturday night. I got, 100% response rate on the Sunday saying this is the most useful thing I've read. I'm going to send it to every CEO I know. And that article kind of became a workshop. The workshop became a program. And then about a year and a half, 2 years later, it became the book.
Super cool. So one of the things you just mentioned that I want to pull on this string a little bit is you mentioned it's a loop. Walk me through that, because I think when most folks hear this, it's more of a checklist. Okay, we survived that, check. Now we've reset, check. Right. But you mentioned the word loop. So walk me through that.
Absolutely. Everything in growth is a loop, not a line. And that sounds really simple to say, but we really love checklists as human beings and as managers and leaders of companies. We love to be done with things, right? When you finally check something off, develop strategy done, communicate strategy done, execute priority done. And that's not how a changing world that we're facing and executing our strategies are in. It's constantly going to be moving and evolving. So we need to move from this checklist mindset of how we approach strategy and growth into this loop mindset. And there's a lot of power in doing that, right? So Survive, Reset, Thrive is a loop. And what happens, let's make it more practical, is you can be in Thrive mode and everything can be going great. And there can be a shock to the system that sends you back to survive. These can be external shocks. You can have a surprise interest rate, a surprise election. You could have a big macro event like war or COVID, but you can also have an investor pull out or lose a major customer. And when that happens, you've got to go back into survive mode. And we don't want to do that. We feel once we've gone through the steps to thrive, we'll stay there. But there's real humility in losing the ego and saying it's time to survive. Then we can go back to reset again. Then we can go back to thrive. So we need to embrace this loop mentality to be able to grow through these different changes that we're facing as we're trying to lead our companies through this uncertainty.
So let's start with, and I really love how you said you have to, embrace the humility to recognize, hey, we're in survival. How do you know, other than you coming in and saying, hey, by the way, or the profit's tanking, what are some key characteristics that okay, we need to go back, or this is where we're at?
I think most of us intuitively know when our organizations are in that mode. And part of what I'm trying to do with Survive, Reset, Thrive is give you permission to make that pause, to say, hey, the survive mode is actually not only opposite of growth, it's part of growth, right? Going through survive and restabilizing is a critical part of the growth journey, not antithesis of it. And like giving you permission, I know that sounds overly simple, Stephanie, but that's a key part of it, right? Is you got to take that pause because most of us know, we just don't want to admit it without kind of the reason for it. So what happens when some of your basics are compromised, and I call the basics the 4 C's, or cash, cost, customers, communication. When something starts impacting our cash flow, when our costs are growing faster than our revenue for a reason outside of hypergrowth or doing something like a land grab, when we've lost a customer or seeing customer churn or having issues with our customers, or communication becomes broken or spotty or lots of friction. If you're going to go through your 4 C's, and what I recommend organizations do is set the baseline. Not the goals, but the baseline. Like, where is the minimum any of these 4 C's should be at any point in time? And when those get triggered, that's a pause point to go into survive mode. And there's real power, again, in knowing when you're in it and admitting it. I always feel like I'm badly paraphrasing Fight Club. The first step is kind of admitting it, but the first step of being survive is admitting you're in survive, because now we can handle it, right? Now we can take all those proactive steps to stabilize and move again out of survive, because you don't want to be in survive longer than you have to. But, and there's a big but, this is a yes but, not a yes and, the longer you refuse to admit that you need to take that stabilize, you're actually losing a lot of things that you need across those 4 C's. So the simplest is set those baseline triggers for cash, cost, customers, and communication. And when you start approaching them, then it's time to take the pause.
So when folks take the pause, in your experience, where have you seen leaders just really handle this well? Like, what have they done to handle this pause, recognition of survive, etc.?
I actually had this experience, and, you can just feel proud of an entrepreneur when they're like, wow, like you can handle all these steps well. I had a company who, one of their major companies, spun out a subsidiary. The subsidiary went bankrupt. So they were facing millions of, euros not going to be paid to them at the end of the year. And when you're a small to medium sized enterprise, a couple of million not coming in does impact you, right? When you're not a major organization. So we're going into survive mode. A lot of that cash, cost, customer, well, actually 3 of our kind of triggers, if you will, have been broken. And they had a strategy workshop scheduled to reset the growth strategy for the next year. The classic response, which is not the right one, by the way, is to cancel the workshop. All hands on deck, focus on operational metrics. He still got his team together, and they repurposed that time to go through their survive metrics, make actionable plans on what they need to do across all the 4 C's, look at their top priorities and say, okay, what still goes, like what pauses, what changes. And the team left the most energized I'd seen them, in a couple of years, when what should have been, one of the worst times they've been in the past 5 years. But they used the time to say, we know what to do here. We've already got the time scheduled. We're going to go through survive. We're going to be stabilized. And they gave themselves a deadline. By the end of Q1 next year, we want to see progress on all of these. We're going to be back to growth mode by the end of Q2. And that's what we want people to do. The temptation, I want to repeat purposely, the temptation is to cancel everything related to strategy and just tell people to be heads down execution mode. In survive mode, you are still in learning mode. You want people heads up, listening, learning, getting these feedback signals from the market, incorporating that in so we can move into reset as soon as possible.
Okay, so then we move into reset, and my mind immediately goes to, that on your phone. When you can't get it to work, you go to the hard reset,
Yes,
but the
yes.
trade-off is you lose everything. I mean, it's like worst case scenario, you're starting all over. Walk me through what reset looks like from your perspective and your counsel.
That's funny because hard resets do happen, but like all of us with our phones, man, you don't want them to, right? But look, hard resets are not the normal reset. The normal reset, you turn the phone off, right? You got to pause and wait a minute, which was probably good anyway because you were getting frustrated, right? It turns back on, boom, you're ready to go again, right? So in a reset, you pause, and with the team, you answer some critical questions that you need to answer for growth. And those questions are 6. What's going on and how's it going to change? And what is success? So where are we going to play? How are we going to win? What could stop us? So what should we do? Go through those 6 questions, reset the situation. What are our changing beliefs about the changing time? Reset our right to win. How are we really going to compete in that changing world? What's that mean for our where to play choices? Define a new finish line or where you want to be at the end of the cycle. address the challenges, and then figure out your top priorities. A normal reset takes kind of a couple of months for any sort of mid-sized organization, a couple of weeks for a very small one. Could stretch longer for a big organization, though I'm never happy about it, but that's just what scheduling happens kind of in these large organizations. And the majority of the time, Stephanie, that's what it is. You go through those 6 questions, you reset, you update. And there's power in doing that every 3 years, even if you don't feel the situation's fundamentally changed. Now, occasionally, those hard resets do happen. And what happens is, as you start to go through those questions, you realize everything's changed. All the fundamental assumptions you had that went into your previous growth strategies have now changed. Completely different situation. Your right to win is eroded. Your where to play choices all need to update. The finish lines you had are now completely outdated, are no longer relevant. And when that happens, you do need to declare a hard reset. And to make it more practical, we're watching these in the market right now. We're watching Starbucks and Boeing and, all of these companies, Nike, Burberry, going through hard resets right now. And that's what's happening. The board realized it wasn't working, CEO out, new CEO in, all of these challenges are being revisited. Now this process could take a couple of months to a year. But you know what? Hard resets can be the most powerful thing that happened for an organization. We sometimes see the most dramatic growth journeys after a hard reset happens.
Okay, so we've realized things have changed. We're refocused. Now it's time to thrive.
Well, first, I appreciate your patience of asking about survive and reset first, because most people want to jump straight to the thrive. They'll say, Rebecca, all I really want to do is talk about thriving. Can I just skip to that part? And I originally joked with the publisher. Well, I wasn't joking, but they didn't take me seriously. Let's only send people the first 8 chapters of the book. And, once they've read those, they can apply. Because you got to do the hard work of the survive and the reset first before you can get to thrive. Because I know my entrepreneurs, right? They jumped right to chapter 10 because that's the part that they cared about. But look, thrive is not a given. It has to be earned. And just because you reset the strategy, what you also need to reset is your execution capability. Different strategies demand different things from the organization in terms of our hardware, like our processes and wiring, our software, like our culture and behaviors, the top team that we need to lead it, our distributed leaders to really guide execution, and this shared understanding. So this transition from the reset to thrive is actually the really difficult part. And more friction happens there than the transition from survive to reset, because we assume that that's a more simple pathway. But resetting a strategy means you need to reset your execution capability and capacity as well. And that could take some time, but you got to be super honest about what's working and what's not. Be prepared to rebuild and reset. Then you can become one of these Thrive organizations. And it's a simple recipe. Thrive organizations have 3 things: strong balance sheets, strategic insights, and they execute with agility and learning, right? You bring your strong balance sheet through from the survive phase, your strategic insights from the reset phase, and then you execute with agility and learning, because strategy is a living, breathing document, and we're going to learn and adjust and change as we go. And that's a key part of being Thrive. Is, again, I'm going to say one of the things you can say to me that really makes me mad is 2 things. I'll give you 2 things not to say to me. Thing 1, just say, oh, Rebecca, we're in heads down execution mode. My first response is, well, get out of that, right? I want you in heads up learning mode, right? And the second is, if you ever send me a document labeled strategy final, all caps, I have this new thing now. I don't even open it. I just reply back to the email and I say, no, it's not. Strategy is never final. We're going to keep updating and adjusting as we're going.
Very cool. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. This continuous learning. I think that's a huge difference maker between leaders that really do thrive and ones that don't. But oftentimes I think a lot of folks fight this natural state of, hey, we're here. Let's not rock the boat and just stay here. And they don't come out and say, I'm done learning, but their actions show that. So walk me through this idea and concept about keeping learning a critical part of this process.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Stephanie. It is not only a critical part, it is the most critical part. Is that in now close to 15 years of working with high growth and high performance organizations, I will say quite simply, it is the number 1 differentiator. Organizations that learn faster are organizations that grow faster. It is the ultimate differentiator, and frankly, differentiator because it's hard. A lot of us pride ourselves on being learning organizations because we do monthly webinars, or we have town halls, or we have share sessions, or we have book clubs, or we go to business schools, like all really cool things, like keep doing them. But that's being a teaching organization, not a learning organization, right? Being a learning organization is what you alluded to, saying we don't have all of the answers yet. So here's the questions we need to ask. Using your customers as learning partners, not just transactional vehicles, encouraging kind of constant experimentation and testing and learning while executing, never assuming that every variable and every metric we have in the plan is the perfect one, right? Because things are going to change as we go. And this is a different culture. Now, being a learning organization doesn't mean that we're changing things all the time, right? Learning is actually very, methodical. Like engineers can do this learning velocity too. In fact, they're quite good at it, right? You can build all of these things for it, but you've got to kind of, again, break the notion that once something is in a plan, the plan must be executed. I know it sounds silly, but words matter. I've said, let's stop calling them strategic plans. There's something about the word plan, right? It just frames our brain. Everything in this must get done. And I want it framed as I'm going to keep learning as I'm going. This strategy is just my best hypothesis of where growth is going to come from over the next 3 years. Like any hypothesis, I got a lot of it right and probably some of it wrong. So I'm going to keep learning and adjusting as I go.
Okay, so now there are strategic hypotheses.
Yes. I'm just dropping the plan word. Again, frames matter, right? And as soon as our brains are framed that everything must get done, I get heads down, and I want people heads up, learning and moving as we go.
Okay, I just have to go back and highlight two things that you said because I think they're so critical and we just don't hear them. One is you define the difference between learning and teaching. I've heard it 101 times. People say, hey, we do all these things, but the way that you turn that, nope, that's when you're teaching. But then going back to ask questions, I think that's the second thing. And so many times when we get out of a learning mode is when we stop asking questions. And to your point, we don't have to be in a constant change mode, but that's real feedback. That's how we know, are we going to get to where we think we want to go, or do we need to change our strategy because where we thought we were going isn't really where our demand is? And learning is asking questions, and continuous learning is not teaching. Talk to me about a must-win battle.
Well, first, I'm agnostic to the language that you pick as an organization, right? So my only thing is whatever term you use for your top strategic priorities, that term must have integrity. So you can't use it for anything else. So if you're going to have 5 strategic priorities, great. The word priority is now protected. It can only refer to those 5 things. Goals, rocks, again, you do you, right? I said not too recently at a summit, the president was saying, well, the CEO doesn't like the term must-win battles. Can we call them so-and-so? And I said, look, call them giraffes, as long as you execute them. Just pick one word, right? That's all I care about. So I started using the term must-win battle, and I've got some colleagues at IMD who use it as well, because we have a mess of language inside organizations. You go to any company from 10 employees to 100,000. They have goals, priorities, aims, rocks, OKRs, KPIs, targets. I could keep going and going, right? And this is in small organizations it happens. So put yourself as an employee. If I've got all of these lists of things, which in the English dictionary, all translate to most important thing, what am I working on every day, right? And you need something that cuts above the noise and says, no, these are the must wins. And I love the language of must win battle, not nice to have battle, not business as usual battle, but these are must wins for growth. And there's really power of the absolute clarity of this is what we must do to get to that finish line. You want them midterm. You want them clearly focused on value creation, and you want them to cut across the organization. A great test for do I have the right list of must-win battles is, did I just rename my departments? By that I mean if you have a marketing one, a sales one, a product one, and a people one, you don't have a strategy. You've just renamed your departments, right? A great must-win battle cuts across the organization because that's how we truly create value. We pull from the best and do this integrated approach to what it takes to drive growth. And that's what you're looking for in a must-win. Again, midterm, 2 to 3 years, focus on value creation, market-oriented, cuts across the organization to bring out the best of what you have.
Give me, if you can, don't want you to violate any confidences, but can you help us point to a real-life example of a company and organization that you've seen go through this loop successfully, just so we get a real-life idea of what it looks like?
Yeah, I've named, luckily I've got wonderful companies that I work with. So almost all of them were willing to be named in the book. So, WD-40 company has gone through this cycle a couple of times now. And I love that example because they're one of also the very few companies I work with where their culture is actually part of their right to win. And their must-win battles are focused on where growth is coming from, right? Not necessarily where growth has been. So great example there. Gorilla Glue Company, another company based in the US, but of course growing globally very quickly. They're on their second cycle of must-win battles. So successful, we had to reset a year early, right, from the original plan because they're going to that next stage of growth. And the company I just mentioned, they're smaller. They're named Homkes, based in Latvia, in Riga, Latvia, one of my favorite places to visit, by the way. And they're on their third cycle, and they've doubled every 3 years since they started this approach. And they're in concrete and construction, and that's about as much as we want them to double. When I work with fintech companies, I'm just wrapped up with one this morning based here in Europe. We want you doubling every year in the scale up phase. But if you're doing anything hard, like construction, concrete, manufacturing, I only actually want you doubling every 3 years. And so I've got lots of them who are having that kind of success. But this takes discipline. And what I've really realized when I look at companies who do this well and others who go through the process and don't is growth is a commitment. And I know you're thinking, of course, Rebecca, eye roll, growth is a commitment. But here's what I mean. You can't just commit to the strategy. You've got to commit to building the capability to execute the strategy. I don't care how smart people are in your organization. Throwing a new growth strategy isn't going to get it done. Are you as a leadership team saying, not only am I committed to this growth strategy, I'm committed to growth, which means I'm going to slow down to speed up. I'm going to make sure I'm building the capability of my team. I'm going to be prepared to change things as the situation changes. I'm going to make some tough decisions on people or markets or products because that's not where growth is coming from. Growth is an absolute commitment, and a lot of organizations aren't prepared to make that commitment. Frankly, it's hard, right? And I'll share something with you, Stephanie. When I wrote the book, one of the first big feedbacks I got from one of the editors was, Rebecca, you say stuff is hard too much. No one likes hard stuff. And they wanted me to rephrase all of that language to make it feel more approachable. And I started to do that. And then I pushed back and I said, I can't do that because this stuff is really hard. But you know what? That's cool. Why? Because when you do the hard stuff well, that's differentiation. And that's what we're trying to do with growth strategies.
Most people, when they hear commitment or discipline, I think the loop in the brain is going to the strategic plan and being committed to the check and the must do's. But what I just heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is the commitment is to the growth.
Yes.
That might mean altering or changing, but it sounds like it's a verb.
Growth is a verb and a noun, right? Is it is constantly changing and moving. Go back to our strategy hypothesis. Now, people hear this and are thinking, no, Rebecca, we're too big. We have shareholders, we have boards. We need to stick to the plan. Plans are hypothesis, right? This is not advocating for chaos. You're having a strategy in place at all times, but you have the humility to acknowledge that we didn't get everything right the first time. And our situation is going to change. And we're going to constantly be bringing that change in. And that means you've got to build this capability for an organization that can handle and adapt to this change. Now, people try to do this, and they do this by cheating. What do I mean by that? Instead of 5 growth priorities, they have 10, or they have 15, or they have 5. But each of the 5 have 5 sub-bullets, each of which have 15 under it. They're trying to caveat for every single iteration the market will give them, right? Which means you're actually starving any of those growth priorities of the time, treasure, or talent they need to succeed. This is why it's hard to be a high growth company. You've got to be ruthlessly prioritized on those few areas of growth, but build the capability of an organization that can adapt and change as the situation around you changes.
Okay. There are so many additional strings I could pull on here to lean in on your expertise. I mean, but in the spirit of time, is there anything else you want to make sure that we address here today together?
I think we'll just repeat, hard is great, right? So just because we've said a couple times things are hard or difficult or only a few people do it, if you've got any sort of entrepreneurial spirit, that should light something in there and say, hold on, like, tell me more, right? Things that are hard are great because when you do hard things well, that is differentiation. everything in Survive, Reset, Thrive is doable. I've seen companies of employees from 10 to several hundred thousand, from 10 million revenue or even smaller to, over 30, 40 billion are working on Survive, Reset, Thrive. You've just got to make the commitment. And I think have an honest conversation with yourself and your team. Do we want to commit to growth? And not everybody does. That's also okay. Right. But then, I'm going to annoy you, right? And you have a conversation with me because I am absolutely passionate. Wake up every single day on what we can do to do this, lead high growth journeys.
Incredible. Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing such meaty content. Very energizing to hear you talk. Thank you.
It was absolutely my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much for the great questions.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And as always, thanks for listening.